you've been with Exton since the beginning.
Well, I have been. I've been president since 2003, but prior to that, I was vice president for Community Incorporated, which included responsibilities for Exton and some of the off-campus centers as well. Kind of shared responsibility. Mary Jo was involved as well. But I remember back, when Exton was first came about, and how it happened and so forth. So.
Could you go into a little bit more detail? It's my understanding that DCCC was already operating in Chester County, but that was its first dedicated independent site. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean it was the leased facility. I mean we for years, as long as I can remember, we've always served thousands of students from Chester County because of the proximity of East Goshen, Westchester, and so forth to this campus. It was easier to get here, frankly, than it was from, say, Westchester, than it was for me to get here from Upper Darby, right? Because of the Route 3. So that's always been the case. So we ventured. We knew that that we wanted to serve Chester County more, and just like we have here, kind of outreach centers and so forth into the heart of Chester County. So the first natural opportunity we had was in Exton. What happened there was that Westchester University had occupied that space, and we were aware of that. And they were pulling back. It was just a different cycle they were going through. For whatever reasons, they were actually pulling their reins back in, and it was a perfect ready-made opportunity for us because it had already been set up as a teaching facility. So we had classrooms that were well appointed and so forth. So it was pretty easy for us to take that over. So it was just a great opportunity for us.
Yeah.
And the rent. I mean, from the very beginning, we had a good relationship with the developer out there, the owner of the facility, Jack Lowe, and we always, from the very beginning, we got a very good rate, and we've been able to maintain that over the years. And that's one of the incentives. When we first opened Downingtown, we thought we might be closing Exton because we thought we might be competing with ourselves. But it turned out that, looking at the demographics, the students there, that we really were drawing from a different population. A lot of people coming home from work and so forth. There were people, working adults who wanted to use that site. And we always, from the beginning, Downingtown, it was a younger group, more high school graduates there directly from high school than Exton always was. So it became apparent in the growth, it appeared right away that we weren't necessarily competing with each other. So we decided to keep Exton and also develop Downingtown.
Yeah, it's an interesting timeline because it seems that Exton expanded into Exton Center 2 in maybe the 2000-2001 time frame. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, there was a capital campaign to develop the Downingtown campus.
Right. I think it opened in 2001, didn't I believe?
Yeah.
Downingtown? Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting timing.
It's always involved with governmental relations and school district relations and all that all along as Dick's assistant. So no, I remember being in the boardroom talking to the commissioners at the time, and we had sort of huddled there and talked about what the role of the college should be. There was from time to time there were different community groups that came together to discuss the possibility of having their own community college. I remember Jim Gerlach was a state senator at the time. Was part of a group that we met with. It was at least exploring that possibility and trying to understand the pros and cons of that and so forth, and only to realize that there are really more pros than cons for us expanding out there. And so Earl Baker, being one of the commissioners, he's the one who was very adamant then that we should become their community college rather than take on the taxes and so forth. Mm-hmm. Associated with creating their own community college. Yeah. And they're very conservative. Raising taxes has always been one of their mantra, or not raising taxes has been very, in Chester County has been very, very strong sentiment. And so the notion of raising taxes to support the college just never made any headway.
And is it accurate that none of their local school districts are sponsoring?
None. And it's nearly never, once or twice we've gotten a phone call from one of the districts, when they get the the tuition bill. They want they see the difference between the sponsor and non-sponsor. I'll get a call, and then as soon as we tell them what the cost would be, first of all, why it is what it is, and then secondly, what it would cost to bring in, you name the district, Westchester or Downingtown school district. They want no parts of it because of the costs. So it's really cut it off. I mean, so we've been basically, by the powers that be have been really invited the college in to become their community college.
Yeah.
And it's always, for a while, it's kind of stuck in their craw, that, the Delaware County Community College. And we massaged that a little bit of calling, Chester County's community college.
Right, serving Delaware and Chester County.
It's like HAC is Central PA's community college.
Right.
We borrow a little bit from that and say, look, we are, I'm out speaking if I'm at a table, introducing myself with other folks. I'll typically say, I'm Delaware County Community College, but we're Chester County's community college.
Yeah. Has there ever been any conversations about altering the name of the institution to
There have been some
that?
discussions, but again, and I've said this openly. I said, look, if the center of gravity shifts, to the extent that it's like half and half or 40-60 or something, I believe we would entertain that possibility. But now it's lower. The numbers are lower. I keep using because it's in print. But we've had like 27,000 students, and I was in roughly 7,000 of those are Chester County. Okay. Now both know those numbers are a little lower than that. But you get the idea.
Yeah.
It's a lot,
it's closer to 1 in 4.
Yeah, exactly. We're not, so, and I haven't heard that in a long. I think now that we're out there and we have a real presence out there, I don't hear that very often anymore. Initially, because I was here then, philosophically, when we created the centers out there in Downingtown, the effort, on the part of Dick DeCosmo was to have a more contained unit, hire people to teach those facilities and so forth. And that I think it's still great. We have a number of the faculty who started there and are still there and so forth. So we wanted to create some kind of a esprit de corps kind of thing, there and so that worked well. The only trouble is when you get into size issues and so forth, and also, faculty have said to us that they sometimes they feel kind of cut off and not part of the discipline and all that sort of thing. So, it worked in both our favors to sort of try to do some integration, some back and forth. And I know some faculty have spent some time here and then go back and that sort of thing. And so that's kind of broke with that initial concept of having them sort of, by themselves out there. And so, I think we try to preserve that, especially if the faculty prefer that. But we're also trying to create some flexibility, for their sake and for our sake, frankly.
Yeah.
Because enrollments come up, and you don't want to be stranded and be without home.
Exactly.
Nobody wants that.
Yeah.
So we've eased up on it. We did some backpedaling early along when we realized that was not probably a smart thing to do. It's all one faculty, in terms of hiring and all that. So, so we sort of have backpedaled from that from the very beginning, and we realized that may not be workable.
When Exton Center opened, it seemed to have a stronger focus on non-credit and workforce and community education. Is that an accurate?
I wouldn't say. No, it always had kind of a small minority operation there.
Oh, okay.
Only here and there we kind of filled in. It was always, well, there was a little tension between Mary Jo and myself because, in her mind, credit came first.
Right.
And I would try to argue that, I for starters, yes.
Yeah.
But there might be instances where actually financially it made more sense because the non-credit was the numbers were much greater.
Mm-hmm.
Take a classroom, you got 8 credit students because that's all there are in that class versus you got 20 non-credit students paying perhaps even more than And so from an economic standpoint, you want to just say categorically that one should rule versus the other. For instance, and Mary Jo, we worked those things out. But
sure.
But generally speaking, that was the rule that credit would have first choice.
Okay.
And there were some here and there. There were some programs that were convenient to Exton, and non-credit classes and so forth. And so
I found something on a fire science and technology.
Yeah, fire science. Yeah,
class that ran or program that ran there.
Exactly. Early emergency management program.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That ran at the center.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's inaccurate then to think that the focus has shifted more towards the academic credit side of the house.
No, I don't think it was always mostly.
It was always mostly that.
Yeah, mostly that.
It seems that the college was already sensitive to the fact that they were serving very different needs at the time. Do you feel that continues to be the case?
I think so. Although we lost some enrollment at both sites, and I think we're trying to figure out our way and trying to, we're not quite sure what's going on. To be honest with you, we have some plans for Exton, as you know, that we think will be hopefully, change the mix and reattract students who that we've lost. We're not entirely sure why we're losing them all, but so that's what we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, I know you're a numbers person.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned enrollment a couple of times. Can you speak sort of from a SWOT analysis perspective to Exton's size as either a weakness or a strength or both from your perspective?
No, I think it's it has to be both.
Right.
The only reason it's a negative is because we can't offer enough.
Right.
If we could, and that's the, so we know that students go back and forth. They'll start there and then they'll have to finish here because ultimately they can't get all the courses they need there. Yeah. And what hasn't worked as well as you might think is the Downingtown Exton piece.
Connection.
It's not that far, but we don't get a lot of students who are sharing the campuses, right?
It's funny you mention that because this semester, for the first time, I'm working at each site.
Yeah,
and sometimes I'll see a student, and they'll say, I want to follow up with you. If I'm working with them Tuesday at Exton, they'll say, can we follow up on Thursday? And I'll say, well, Thursday I'm in Downingtown. It's 10 minutes down the bypass. And they're like, oh.
I know. It's like they it is so close. And that was, like I said, initially we almost, closed it for that reason.
Yeah.
But, so whatever, that doesn't work. But we do know it does. Many of them are kind of forced, and so in terms of looking at completion, Mary Jo and staff there are very, very much aware of the fact that we may not lose a student to the college. We may lose them to the campus, but not, to the Exton. But they're still here and finishing up. So we need to, keep track of those students, Now, did you mention, do you know about the middle college at all?
I was actually just getting down. Would you talk about
list?
that? It is, the Cheska Middle College High School that was started in 2003.
Yeah.
So that would have been very early in your presidency at the college.
Well, I was involved when I was vice president back then.
Okay.
Again, for a while, I'm not sure why, but Mary Jo and I were, and it was in conjunction with the intermediate unit.
Right, CCIU.
CCIU. Yep. And we looked at some different models. We actually visited 3 different sites, one in LaGuardia, I think, Community College, and a couple down south. And then one was in North Carolina, and I forget where else the other one was. But are you familiar with the middle? It's a little different. It was a different population of students that were actually quite successful. I mean, there were hundreds of students at these different campuses. And these were high school kids who were sort of, they're typically good students, but they were kind of socially marginalized, sort of, for whatever reason. Didn't quite fit in, and and so forth. And so they took to these to these very much so, and more avant-garde kind of in terms of students in many cases. But we saw a couple different models that were quite successful, and we thought this would be. The IU was very interested also for finding a home for these students who weren't really succeeding in their home. Typically big high schools where the kids were just lost in the bigness of the school and so forth. And so we together we what made it work though was having a community college, having these students on a college campus, typically a community college. That was the difference. So it was having it away from their high school friends and so forth, but on a college campus. And so, I believe for the most part, they were community colleges. There may have been some 4-year schools, but typically they're community colleges. And so one of us or all of us picked up on this idea and thought this would be, a great partnership for some of our students. So we we figured that the Exton Center was a good opportunity. We were able to get some additional space there, and so we added on some space behind Exton 1.
Okay. Which
has now been repurposed because they moved it off. They moved it years later, but at the time we actually added on to Exton 1, and they had their own kind of separate operation in the back. They had their own high school principal and teachers and so forth. And I think there were 60 students or something on that order at one time. They struggled. I mean, part of the problem they struggled, it wasn't us so much as the school sending schools didn't quite understand who these people were. These students were, unfortunately, and they wanted to send you the IEP students. They wanted the ones that were, had social issues, and so these kids were not misfits. They just they were just not fitting in as well as they wanted to. So what happened is that little by little the school districts kind of sabotaged it. I don't know if they did it deliberately or not, but they just wanted, in some cases they just wanted the kids out of the building. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like the VOTEC kids in some cases. And so it started out all right, with that model in mind and so forth, and I think it worked out well initially. And the other idea too is as soon as the students were able to, they would take college courses. So it was a combination of taking their own high school classes that were set up in those classrooms there, but also then integrating them into our classes. So at any one time, probably a third of the students were actually taking college classes. The other 2/3 were just taking high school classes. So.
And was dual enrollment, was that an early model for dual enrollment?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely, yes, okay. It was.
The other theme that you mentioned that I wanted to pick up on was the idea of scale and the size of the center.
Well, let me finish that one because that
absolutely.
Well, that just lasted. Unfortunately, it did. Like I said, the schools sort of sabotaged it.
Yeah.
And eventually, the numbers got too low, and they for whatever reason they had changed in their own leadership over there and so forth. For their purposes, it made sense for them they moved to another facility. I'm not quite sure where. Okay. And so they vacated that space in the back, which is. That, and we since have repurposed that and used it for different reasons. But just to finish that story, in the last several years, there's been an effort to coalesce all the business classes and make it a kind of a business center, and so that's done. That was done intentionally, and I know we get some pushback from a few business students who would like to take their business class at Downingtown, mm-hmm. and we say no, they're at Exton, and that's just a way to be more economical in terms of trying to fill the classes and so forth, and have enough classes to, run at Exton. So you can come closer to finishing a degree in Exton. It's been a real motivation for that. So that that's continue to grow that aspect of Exton is important. We now have Widener University's their nursing school was relocated. I think that's only for a 5-year period because I think they're building their own nursing school, and so at some point they'll move back to Westchester. But in the meantime, we're sharing some classes on the Exton campus. We're going to be moving. This kind of fell on our lap recently, and that is, we have at Chester County Hospital, we've had a nursing program for years, mm-hmm. and the building they have in the back, you don't even see it. It's this little, small
little Rhodes building
that hasn't really been kept up at all.
Right,
is back there, and so. We've always feared that at some point they're going to realize that it's back there, and the hospital is going to take it over, and so we've always been a little worried about the future of that.
Yeah.
Well, they haven't called the question. They haven't come to us and said, look, we need this by when, but given the fact that we have fewer students at Exton, and you get the Widener partnership right there. And, it just made sense for us to get ahead of that and not do it at the last the last minute and have to suddenly scramble to get new facilities and all that sort of. So we decided to sort of take matters in our own hands, and we're creating a sim lab on the campus, starting I guess as soon as we can next year.